we have 5 more commandments in the 10 commandments left for us to meditate. So all that we would do today, try to give you the gist of the 5 commandments and try to look at how these commandments is applicable to us today and useful for our life with God. And the 10 commandments that we are going to meditate upon is the 6 to 10 commandments, which you will find in Exodus chapter 20, verses 13 to 17, as well as Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 17 to 21. Community is God's provision to the redeemed to live the kingdom life. So we have come into the kingdom of God through Jesus Christ. And the life in the kingdom. And now, what God had done, God has given the community of these redeemed people so that we can live together, live the life of the kingdom. So when you talk about the redeemed, we are the people who are called out to live a distinct life. And when you are talking about the redeemed, we are talking about spiritually, emotionally, and mentally transformed to look at life differently from the world. That's what the redeemed people are. We look at life differently from the world, spiritually, emotionally, as well as intellectually, mentally, and otherwise. The reason for this is our new relationship with our God through Jesus Christ. And the purpose of God in us, not only to enjoy God's relationship with us, but also to bear witness to the world, witness to the truths about God and our relationship with God. That's the purpose of God, bringing us together so that we can live as a community, the community that would live the life of the kingdom, so that we can bear witness to the world about the truths about our God as to who He is and who we are and our relationship. And when Jesus talked about us, Jesus said we are the light to the world and we are the salt of the earth. In other words, what it means is we are the people who influence or who remain an influence in the society. The people around us, they are being influenced by our life and the truth about God. If you look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 to 14, Jesus was talking about this, being the light and being the salt in this world. And also in chapter 5, verse 16, Jesus said, "Let your light shine before men and women in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." The people must be able to see our good works as we live in this kingdom life and glorify our God in heaven so that our God's name will be lifted up. And therefore, this is the context in which we are going to look at the last 5 commandments. These commandments that we see has been given to us by God so that the life in the community, the kingdom life, that will be a blessed life. There are 2 ways that we can look at these 5 commandments positively. What we must not do in order to enjoy kingdom life. We must not do these things. And negatively, what would destroy our kingdom life and our relationship with God. So that is what you have to understand as far as these 5 commandments is concerned. Because the earlier 5, we have seen our relationship with God, how to honor God. And then In between, we have looked at the family as going to be a link between God and the society, because the values of every individual is drawn from the family life and then is shown in the community life in the kingdom. And therefore, now these 5 commandments needs to be understood in the context of the community that God had created with the redeemed people. So the 6th command that we are looking at in chapter 20, Exodus verse 13, a succinct statement, you shall not murder. Sometimes it is translated, you shall not kill. It is better expressed by saying, do not commit murder, because it relates to the homicide. It relates to murder, because the commandment is not about taking human life in any or every circumstances, because you see there is a justice system that God had provided through Moses in the law, where you will find there is just punishment, capital punishment for the murderers, as well as you will find that there is a very clear legal system concerning a warfare. And these warfare or these criminal activities of some people that needs to be punished and set right. Now, these are things that happen in the world because of the wickedness of the world, because of the sins of the world. And therefore, these are the necessities of the sinful world. And therefore, we must not confuse with the justice system, the war that comes as a result of many reasons. And therefore, we need to look at this as referring to the murder that is committed in the society. Now, in this command, the issue is life. The premises in which this command is given is God is the giver and preserver of life. Therefore, life must be preserved. In other words, we have no right over our life, because God is our source. We have received this life from God, and it is God's blessing to us, and therefore God has the authority and the power as far as our life is concerned. And therefore we must depend upon God for enjoying and experiencing this life that God had given to us. And therefore we have no right to take the life from somebody. And therefore, when you want to define murder, murder is a violent, malicious, and willful assault on the life of another person. That's how Murray has put it. So what is the motivation to murder? How does murder happens? Jesus explained this in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 5, verse 22. We do know that the Sermon on the Mount is a very broad subject that you have in Matthew's Gospel, starting from chapter 5, and where Jesus also took up some of these commandments and then explained the real spirit of the law, the meaning of the law that he explained to the people. And Jesus explained this murder, it involves anger and hatred. For example, if you look at Cain's story in Genesis chapter 4, if you look at verses 5 to 9, God had already warned Cain, if you do not control your anger, the sinful attitude that you have, it is like the sin or the wild animal crouching at the door, and it will bounce on you. And Cain did not listen to God. He did not obey God. As a result, the first murder in the first family took place, and Abel, his brother, was murdered by him. And he just yielded to that anger that God had warned him about. And Jesus taught the true application of this command, that it is not simply the physical murder that we commit. It includes even the thoughts, the words, the deeds, the anger, and insults. Everything is part of this cause of murder. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verse 21, we need to understand what kind of anger we are talking about. It's not all kinds of anger. Jesus was angry when he went to the temple, when he saw the temple premises was not used properly. In other words, to put it in the right way, he saw the abuse of God's house there, and he was very angry. The cause of God actually burned within him. The zeal for God had burned within him. He was very angry. He made a whip. He had to beat them up and chase them out. And what we can see in Jesus' anger is that how people could abuse the provisions of God in God's name, and therefore his anger would be called as a just anger. And Jesus was angry in you. If you look at Old Testament, you will find the anger of God various places. Because when God saw the people in sin and deserved judgment, and when he saw the wickedness of the people in the world, God was very angry. For example, in Numbers, the people of Israel, when they had come to the point where God is going to give them the land that God promised, the spies were sent. They came back, gave a very bad report, because the land was full of people who are very big physically, warriors, and therefore they frightened the people. And God's regret and anger was, how long these people won't trust me and believe me even after seeing all the signs and wonders that I have done before them. In other words, the lack of trust, the lack of faith on God, even after experiencing God, even after seeing all that God had done and what God had provided them, still there is that lack of faith, and God was very displeased. And God even told Moses, let me destroy them, and I will bring out a holy generation from you. God was angry because of how the people responded to God. And in 1 John chapter 3, verse 15, John was saying, anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. Now this is where John was talking about the love of God. Now you cannot love your neighbor whom you can see. How can you love God whom you are not able to see? And therefore, the opposite of love is this anger and hatred. And he was saying that it is equivalent to murder. Anger against sin is what we need to understand. And therefore, anger and insults are ugly signs of a desire to get rid of somebody who stands in our way. That's the sign of the sinful anger, because you do not want that person or somebody would obstruct what you desire to do, and you are very angry and you are insulted, you want to get rid of him, and then you find that it leads to commit bigger sin. And therefore they indicate our evil wish. When you're talking about that hatred and when you're talking about that anger, a ugly sign that we are talking about the desire to get rid of somebody who stands on our way, that indicates our evil wish. What is that evil wish? That we wish that he or she were dead. That's what our wish was in such a kind of a anger. And therefore Paul advises to deal with anger immediately. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26 and 27, Paul was saying, be angry and do not sin. In other words, he recognizes our human nature. But on the other hand, he also recognizes the help of the Spirit of God in us. He recognizes that we are a redeemed people. Even though we live in this fleshly or sinful flesh, yet we have these temptations. And what he's saying is, it is possible to be angry, but on the other hand, see that you do not sin because you control your anger. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Give no opportunity to the devil. That was the advice that Paul had given. And Jesus, when he talked about this anger in chapter 5, Matthew's Gospel 22, Jesus followed it up with a different teaching. What did Jesus say? The verses, if you look at the passage, if you look at that passage in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 5, verses 23 to 26, Jesus was talking about reconciliation. Reconciliation and forgiveness. In other words, he gave an example. You go to the altar and you want to give an offering to God, and that's the moment God reminds you. There is a remembrance comes into your mind that your brother has something against you. This is a moment you come in the presence of God. There at the presence of God, a place of mercy. That's what the altar represents. The altar represents a place of mercy, a place of forgiveness. And when you come there to give your offering before God, and then you remember there is something that your brother has against you. And what Jesus said is, leave your offering there before the altar and go your way first. Be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering. So how to deal with anger? How to deal with something that is there in your heart for a very, very long time against somebody, or somebody is against you. And you have to reconcile. That's the kingdom life we are talking about. A kingdom life that we are in that is full of reconciliation and forgiveness. And Matthew 5:23 to 26 reveals that aspect of our life in the kingdom. And in Romans chapter 12, verse 17 to 21, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay. You don't take revenge. You don't show your vengeance. The murder that we're talking about, the anger and the hatred that builds up in our heart, you will find that the vengeance that comes in our heart to take somebody's life or to do something against somebody, and God is pointing out, vengeance is mine. Someone has been wicked and someone had been against you. I will judge. I will take care of that person. You be patient. It is not your job to take revenge on anybody. And if you read Psalms 37, and that is what Psalmist is saying, do not fret over the wicked people. And in verse 8 he says, if you fret over them, you will also become like them. And therefore, don't fret over. Leave it to me. Trust God. And God will do his job. And therefore, when you're talking about vengeance is mine, to the contrary, what Jesus said, or what you are looking at in Romans chapter 12, to the contrary, instead of taking your vengeance, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is kingdom life. This is against anger and hatred. And how to deal with this anger and hatred is to remember our God is above and he is our judge. And he will take care. Trusting him. And what God said, you don't have to repay evil for evil, but you overcome evil with good acts in your life. In 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 9, Peter is saying, do not repay evil for evil, but bless those who curse you, that you may be blessed. And Peter also teaches we are called to bless others. We are not called to curse anybody. We are called to bless. Remember that we are called to bless others. You always bless others. And therefore, we don't have to repay evil for evil, but bless those who curse you, because we are called to bless, and that will bring blessing upon our life. And we need to understand murder. And as I already pointed out, it goes into various other areas. Murder is not just simply a physical assault on somebody, but it also goes into other aspects of our insults and anger and all kinds of evil that we may tend to do against other people. And also we need to understand, how do we decide on many of our ethical questions. Now today, if you look at our Christian world, one of the issues that we talk about mostly is about abortion and many other such kinds of things. And what should we do? How do we decide whether it is right or wrong, whether should I do it or not? These are the principles that God, the Bible, has left for us so that we can make the right decision on many of these issues. This is about murder, because that disturbs the community that God has put you in. And when you murder somebody in the community, and then that destroys the peaceful kingdom life that God has given to us. And therefore God says, do not commit murder. And this next one, number 7 in the commandment is, you shall not commit adultery. This is the next commandment concerning adultery. The issue here is marital purity. That's the issue. When you're talking about you should not commit adultery, the issue here is the marital purity based on God's purpose of the institution of marriage. In the New Testament, when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, explaining to them about this relationship, about the divorce especially, they were talking about the reasons for divorce. What are the reasons? But Jesus was replying, pointing out to them the institution of marriage that God had established. Now, where should be our focal point as far as our marriage relationship is concerned is on the institution that God had established. Adultery is the violation of the sanctity of marriage relationship. It is not only a physical violation, but spiritual violation also. Because the husband-wife, the institution of marriage that God had said, if you read Genesis chapter 2, in the last part of that chapter, verses 24 and 5, where God said, because the woman had been taken out of man, and then the comment in verse 24 is, they are one in flesh. She will leave the mother and father. They will be one flesh. The oneness, the unity that is there in the relationship. And if at all we find the highest relationship in human relationship in the world is the husband-wife relationship. That's where the unity and the oneness of flesh comes. And no other relationship can equal or match that relationship of the husband and wife. And you will find in chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 25, immediately after verse 24, is that they were naked and they were without shame. In the sense of they were guiltless. There was no guilt in them. The purity of that relationship, the spiritual purity. There was physical purity in their relationship. There was also the spiritual purity that you see in this relationship. And therefore, Jesus explained adultery involved more than physical act. It involved every immoral thoughts and deeds. It's not simply a physical act, but rather it involved every immoral thoughts and deeds. This is where Jesus explained Even if you look at a woman with lustful eyes, and then you have already committed adultery. Because in your heart, in your mind, in your spiritual being, you have already by thought and by your look and the rest of the things that you have committed adultery, and therefore it is not simply a physical act alone. If you look at also 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9, Galatians chapter 5 verse 19, 2 Samuel chapter 13 verses 12 and 14, many other passages where you will find that the Bible explains adultery, fornication, rape, incest, sodomy, all unnatural, lustful relationship, everything comes under this adultery. And therefore you see that all these things are not acceptable to the people who belong to God, the redeemed people. That's why I said right in the beginning, when you're talking about the redemption actually involves the spiritually, emotionally, mentally transformed outlook. We do not have the outlook of the world. We are different. And our minds are changed, our thinking has changed, our intellect has changed, our spiritual relationship has changed. Because everything now related and understood with our relationship with God, who is holy and just. And therefore, we as redeemed people, we cannot think of all these kinds of immoral activities in our life, which is not acceptable to be God's people. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, Jesus connected adultery with divorce. Jesus went further and associated adultery to divorce. In a divorce, he said, only for the reason of unchastity, adultery. And therefore, it cannot be for any other reason, because during the time of Jesus, the Pharisees had so many laws and reasons for divorcing. And what we need to understand as we talk about the divorce, which is related to the adultery, in Matthew's Gospel 19, verse 8, Jesus said, this law of divorce was given because of the hardness of the people. When you talk about the hardness of the people or hardness of the heart, what it means is this law concerning divorce is a provision that God had given in order to stop the spreading of the sin. It is not a privilege. When adultery is committed, this adulterous behavior and the adulterous relationship cannot spread. Because an adulterous person, when that person marries somebody else, and then relationship also is called as adultery. And therefore, in order to stop that spreading of sin, God gave a provision. Because if something happened like that in your society, redeemed society, in the kingdom life, stop it. Stop it at this point. And therefore, it is not a privilege for any reason. Just go on and divorce the union that God had created for you with your partner, life partner. And therefore, that needs to be understood. And Jesus said in this Matthew 19:8, this was not the case right from the beginning, but rather this came as a result of sin and the sinful activities of the human beings. Paul, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 4, he says that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor. Hebrews, we also have in chapter 13, the sanctity of marriage, how to preserve your marriage bed in holiness. Do not corrupt your marriage bed. Therefore, what is advised to us is how to control our own body in holiness and honor. This is where the knowledge of God, the more you understand, the more you relate yourself to the God who had given you life and redemption, the relationship and the knowledge of God actually prevents us from involving in all kinds of sins. And therefore, knowledge of God actually touches the will of a person. What is the will? I have that will to do things and not to do things. Discipline and control. And therefore, the advice is, the more I understand God, the better relationship that I have with God actually works in my will and makes me to say no to sin. And therefore, we need to understand the advice. God has given us that grace to control our body in holiness and in honor. The next commandment, number 8, is thou shalt not steal. What is involved here, the issue, is about the property. It involves honesty and uprightness in our dealings with our neighbors in the society. It is a virtue of relationship. Stealing, if you want to define, of course we all know what is stealing, but if you want to put that in words, stealing is taking something that does not belong to us. That does not belong to us. The heart of the commandment, when you talk about the stealing, the heart of the commandment is God is the owner of all. That's the heart of the commandment. How is it related there? If you look at Psalm chapter 24, verse 1, it says, the earth is Lord's and its fullness thereof, and the world and those who dwell therein. Everyone, everything belongs to God. God is the owner. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, it's a very beautiful chapter because this is where there is a reflection of Moses about what God had done during their 40 years of wilderness journey. There is a reflection there. But there is only one particular point that I just want to bring about from this chapter 8, where God had warned the people, when you go into that land that I'm going to give you, and when I bless you with all the provisions there in that land, when you eat well and live happily, and when you are satisfied, God said, thank God for God's provision. But if you become proud in your heart and then say, it is all because of my ability, my strength, I got all of this, and God said, I will judge you. God made them to understand that God is the one who gives that land, and God is the owner, and these people are only tenants there. We know our experience in the earthly life. If you are living on a rented house, you can't even put a nail without the permission of the owner. That's the condition. And we live on this earth, it belongs to God, and God is the creator, God is the provider. When we trust in Him, God provides. There are these laws given to the people of Israel. One is the law of inheritance is there, I'll come to that. And also there is a law about the sabbatical year and the jubilee year. In the sabbatical year, that is the 7th year, they should not till that land. They should not take work from the animals even. And they should leave that land fallow. Even the land and the animals and every workers for them, they should have that rest on the 7th year. And God said, don't worry how you would eat on the 7th year. God said, on the 6th year, I will give you double of the produce. It is in God's hand. Every year you have enough, and on the 6th year, God will give the provisions for 2 years. More than that, in the Jubilee year, it is the 49th, that is the sabbatical year, and the 50th year is the Jubilee year, and both the years, they have to leave the land fallow. 2 years. God said, 40th year, you will have enough to eat for these 2 years also. God is the provider. And that is where comes also the law of inheritance. When the people came into that land, God had divided the land and give it to every family. The people who came into the land. And God said, it is your inheritance. You cannot sell this land to anybody. It belongs to the family. It will remain with the family. But in case you mortgage this land because of your need to somebody, the person took that land and gave some money to that person who was in need. When it comes to the Jubilee year, he cannot simply keep that land because it is that person's inheritance that God had given, and therefore whether he had paid the money back or not, he should return that land to him. God's mercy and also God's authority, he is the owner of that land. That is given by God to him. And it is also said in the archaeology, they never discovered a sale document in Israel because you can't sell. It belongs to you and your family. There is another incident in the book of Kings. It's about Naboth and the king Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Jezebel was not an Israelite. She was a Phoenician woman. And Ahab was an Israelite. And Naboth had a land in the valley, very, very fertile place and very fertile, prosperous place, and where he had that vineyard, it was very good. And Jezebel and Ahab had an eye on that field, and Ahab went to ask Naboth, give me that land, I want it. And you know the reply Naboth gave to Ahab was, it is my inheritance, and therefore I cannot give it to you. He comes back home very sad. You know what his wife advised? She was not an Israelite, a Phoenician woman. She said, you are a king. He is only a commoner. Go kill him, take it. Violence, murder. It is also part of the covetousness we can look at. But then this is the stealing of what belongs to someone else because you become greedy. Greed is the aspect for stealing. That's what Bible is pointing out. You are not satisfied with what God had given you. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, if you read chapter 2, Ecclesiastes is saying, satisfaction is a gift from God. Man, by his own sinful nature, can never be satisfied with anything that he has. But it is God who gives us satisfaction. He gives us satisfaction. I'm always happy because God gives me satisfaction. That should be the testimony of everybody who is part of the redeemed community. In the redeemed community, in the kingdom life, you cannot have that greed. You cannot grab somebody else's property. You cannot take someone else's property and say, I want it. And satisfaction is a gift from God. And therefore, stealing, it's not only from men. Stealing, it is described, is also from God that people do. In Malachi, the last prophet in the Old Testament, if you read chapter 3, verse 8 to 10, God was saying, you have robbed me. And the people said, how did you rob you? How did you steal from you? God said, by not giving the tithes and the thanksgiving offerings to me, because that belongs to me. You are not giving it. You are cheating on it. And the Bible talks about the obligation to help other people in the community. If you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8 to 9, there is an obligation as a redeemed people to help others, to give others. And also there is an advice to give cheerfully, a cheerful giving to God. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 26 verse 14, 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7, and in Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 17, how much to give to God? Quite often people ask that question. When you talk about the tithes, when you talk about the offerings, what is the right giving? They think they are very clever. What is the right giving? Because only those people who don't want to give, you ask for what is right giving. It is a cheerful giving, that's the right giving. And it is also proportionate giving. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 17, according to the blessing of God, God has given. That is the proportionate giving. Even in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12, as the Lord had blessed you, accordingly you give. You don't have to define this. For 8 rupees you give 2 rupees or 3 rupees. You don't have to define that. If you are with God, that proportionate giving, God has blessed me so much, and therefore it goes from my heart to give to God. That's where Jesus pointed out a good example. Here is a widow. She had only 2 pennies. That's all she had for her life and for the day. And she put that in the offering box, and Jesus said, she had given more than anyone else. You had given from what you have, but she had given everything she had. The cheerful giver, the proportionate giver, the grateful giver. Now that is what it talks about. And therefore, when you talk about stealing, stealing is not only from people, stealing is also we do from God. And therefore, I think we need to think about how I gave and whether I cheat God, rob from God, and how do I respond to God and God's blessing in my life. The next commandment number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And what is at stake here? The issue that is there is love your neighbor by honoring his or her reputation. In this command, what you see is another person's reputation. By false witness, what it means is, it is not the truth. You are trying to put down that person by bearing a lie or telling a lie, bearing a false witness. And therefore, when you talk about love your neighbor, this is what you would see when Jesus explained the whole law. The summarized law, what he said, first commandment that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, love your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your might. Love your God. And then the second commandment coming from Leviticus chapter 19. And Jesus said, love your neighbor. That covers all the prophets and all the law, everything in the Old Testament, said Jesus. And therefore, when you're talking about your neighbor, how you respond to God is how you respond to your neighbor. And therefore, you cannot dishonor God as well as you cannot dishonor your neighbor. And there were clever people there at the time of Jesus. The Pharisees, they said, who is my neighbor? And Jesus said the Samaritan story. The good Samaritan, as we would call that. How, even though this person, Samaritan, was hated by the Jews, neither the Levite nor the priest helped that person who was in need. But it is the Samaritan who was hated. He helped that person who was in need. So who is a good neighbor? Your neighbor is the one that would respond to me. And you would respond to God. And therefore, how do I relate myself with my neighbor? By honoring him and not hurting his reputation and honor. And John's Gospel, chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus said, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life. And when you tell a lie, you are actually speaking against this God who says, I am the life and the truth. Our God is truth. And when we follow this God and tell a lie, bear false witness, we are not God's children. If you are redeemed spiritually, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, we are a transformed people. We don't think like the world, but rather we think as God thinks. The Spirit of God who is in us enlightens us with God and understanding of God. And therefore, God is truth, and therefore I must be true. I cannot bear false witness. Godliness requires truthfulness. If we talk about godliness, we are talking about being truthful to God and to my neighbor. A person may be judged by court or individual, innocent or guilty, by the testimony that other person gives against him or for him. And therefore, when he bear a false witness, an innocent person may be judged as guilty. And who is responsible? The person who bore false witness is responsible. And God will judge that person. In Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 to 19, there is a list of 6 that God hates. And it says it is an abomination in the sight of God. What are that? Haughty eyes, lying tongue, shedding of innocent blood, heart that devises wicked plans, feet that hastens to do evil, a false witness who breathes lie. Look at the way, beautifully put. A false witness who breathes lies, the very breathing, the whole person in his personality, a liar. Who is a liar? It's Satan only is described as a liar and a father of lies. And we belong to God, who is truth, who is life, and who is the way. And therefore, we cannot be part of that kind of a group who bear false witness. And here where we need to understand Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 16 to 18, God said, "Do not pervert justice for the weak, because you remember Egypt. You were slaves, and how you had been oppressed unjustly. Remember that. And therefore, in your life, when God has delivered, God has redeemed, and you do not pervert justice for the weak. Always support the justice for the weak." And finally, the last command, you shall not covet. The issue here is our heart. Covetousness is related to our heart. In James chapter 4, verse 2, James is saying, you desire and do not have it, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. In other words, why somebody is murdered? Because you have a desire to have something that person has, or maybe you don't like that person because you have some other desire and you kill him. And when you covet something, you want something that somebody else has, and you cannot obtain that, what do? You fight and quarrel. That's the consequence of covetousness. When you don't get it, and then you want to fight and you want to quarrel, you want to murder. That's what happened to Naboth. That's what Ahab and Jezebel had done. When they coveted and they did not get what they wanted, they murdered him. The covetousness can lead to very serious sin in our life. When you look at the 10 Commandments there in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, the covetousness cover many things. Look at chapter 20, verse 17 of Exodus. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And that would lead to adultery and many other things. You shall not or his male servant or his female servant. You don't take possession of somebody else's property. And you should not covet the other's ox or his donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Don't covet anything, because coveting leads to every sin that you can imagine. It is greediness. It is not being satisfied with what God had given to you, and therefore you covet. And covetousness destroys your relationship and destroys the peace that you have in your own life and in your neighbor's life. And therefore, the community that God had given, where God had given this community life to the redeemed people, where we can exercise all the blessings and the good ways that God has shown us. Now, this is the framework for good life. How can we, as God's people in this world of sin and wickedness, still experience God and the goodness of God in our life? There is on one side, you have the wickedness. That is in the middle of this evil and wickedness in the world we live. But we live as God's children. Our lifestyle is not the same as the wicked world, but rather it is distinct. As Jesus said, we are the light to the world and we are the salt of the earth. When the people see the light in us, the good works in us, God's name will be glorified. Amen. God bless you.